Paul Newman revealed 7 actors he hated the most. In 2008, the New York Times published a piece of information that sent shockwaves through public opinion, just 3 days after Paul Newman passed away. His personal secretary discovered an unpublished blacklist. According to eyewitness accounts, Paul Newman personally wrote this list himself in red ink, recording 7 names he despised and held in the deepest contempt throughout his life. What was even more shocking, all of them were top Hollywood stars. Yet each was associated with behavior so bizarre and unacceptable that Newman simply could not turn a blind eye. On that list was someone who had once been his close friend. And even a person who had made him feel as though he was barely alive, right on a film set. So who were those 7 names? What could possibly drive a calm, reserved man like Paul Newman to such fury that he felt compelled to immortalize his hatred in a list that would last beyond his lifetime? 1. Steve McQueen, suffocating demands and calculated power games. The first name called out on the list of people who made Paul Newman grit his teeth was none other than Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen and Paul Newman both embodied the archetype of American masculinity on screen. Yet behind that glamorous exterior lay a simmering confrontation, filled with jealousy and calculation, quietly unfolding behind posters displayed all over the world. We didn't work together, we merely tolerated each other. The Towering Inferno, 1974, was the only film in which Newman and McQueen appeared together. And to get these 2 men to stand within the same frame, the production team was forced to accept a list of demands that bordered on the absurd. McQueen refused to step onto the set unless his salary matched Newman's. His number of lines was equivalent. The number of staircases he climbed in the burning building was meticulously calculated. And most importantly, his name could not appear after Newman's in the opening credits. The result was a poster so strange it was hard to believe. McQueen's name appeared first. Yet Newman's name was placed higher, a warped arrangement that perfectly reflected the nature of their relationship. Director John Guillermin once shared, "Paul felt completely drained. This was supposed to be a disaster film, where people put their egos aside to save others. But Steve counted every line of dialogue, weighed every shot, as if it were a personal contest." To Newman, acting was collaboration, supporting one another to elevate the film. To McQueen, every moment in front of the camera was a fight to the death. Who stood out more? Who would be remembered first? Some actors see filmmaking as competition. I see it as cooperation, Newman said in a 2002 interview. He didn't need to name names, everyone understood. But what disappointed Newman most deeply was not only McQueen's oversized ego, but the emptiness behind that halo of fame. McQueen made no effort to hide his ambition to dominate the screen. Yet his performances lacked inner depth. A lighting technician who once worked with him recalled, "Steve didn't care what the character was thinking or why they acted the way they did. He only cared whether the scene made him look cool." They were like 2 guns perpetually aimed at each other, even after the cameras stopped rolling. 2. John Wayne, the defining face of white supremacist ideology. Ranked second on Paul Newman's blacklist was a name that stunned the public: John Wayne, one of the greatest cinematic icons in American history. Few could have imagined that these 2 Hollywood titans would stand in such profound opposition, harboring such deep mutual animosity. Yet the truth was that Paul Newman did not merely feel uncomfortable around John Wayne, he despised him. Newman was a registered Democrat, a liberal thinker who consistently spoke out for human rights and against war. In stark contrast, John Wayne became a living symbol of rigid conservatism. In a shocking 1971 interview with Playboy, Wayne openly voiced opinions that ignited public outrage. He declared, "I believe in white supremacy," and argued that black people were not yet fit to lead unless they had been properly educated. He also attacked Native Americans, claiming that the seizure of their land was merely a matter of survival, and accusing them of monopolizing territory. In that same interview, Wayne dismissed Midnight Cowboy as perverted and used derogatory language to insult gay people. Wayne's actions extended far beyond words. He was a co-founder and leading figure of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an extreme conservative organization notorious for blacklisting and destroying the careers of directors and actors suspected of being communists or deemed insufficiently American. To Newman, this was not simply a political disagreement. He felt betrayed by an icon, a man who, in his view, should have understood history, suffering, and the moral responsibility carried by cinema. Had the issue been limited to political differences alone, Newman might have let it pass. But there was one thing he could never accept in the acting profession: John Wayne, in his eyes, did not truly act. Wayne merely repeated himself, from one film to the next. Newman once articulated this fundamental difference with clarity. "I try to become a different person in every role. He doesn't. It's always John Wayne, the familiar gun, the cold stare, and those outdated ideas." For Newman, acting was transformation, transcending the self to live another life. John Wayne, by contrast, represented an endless repetition of a deified image, the so-called American hero that Hollywood had fossilized and preserved through nostalgia. In 1979, when John Wayne died, Hollywood and the entire nation mourned. Paul Newman, however, remained unusually silent. Only much later did Newman offer a single remark about Wayne. "We disagreed on almost everything. But you can't deny he was an institution. And yes, sometimes institutions drive you crazy. That doesn't make them insignificant. But it doesn't make forgiveness any easier for me either." And if John Wayne symbolized an outdated ideology trapped in the glow of fame, then the next name on the list unveiled a different kind of tragedy, a genius despised not only for his extraordinary talent, but because he personally burned his own legacy through indulgence and chaos. 3. Marlon Brando, the Godfather, legend and a life of scandal. The next name to appear on Paul Newman's blacklist left Hollywood stunned into silence: Marlon Brando, once revered as the giant of acting. Paul Newman and Marlon Brando never appeared together in a single film. Yet they were like two opposing magnetic poles, comparable talent, similar looks, and on multiple occasions, even auditioning for the same roles. And yet, instead of becoming kindred spirits, a quiet but profound fracture existed between them. Robert Redford, Newman's close friend and longtime collaborator, once recalled Paul's words to him. Paul admitted that Marlon was a genius, but he was furious watching that talent being discarded, squandered, humiliated every time Brando stepped onto a set without preparation. Brando struggled with alcoholism, violence, and an obsession with power and control. He was emotionally fragile, yet frequently manipulative. Many saw him as a wounded narcissist, using art and sexuality as armor to protect a brittle ego. Directors and colleagues recounted that Brando constantly resisted direction, insisting on doing things his own way and refusing to be shaped by anyone. Although he won an Academy Award, his reputation gradually eroded as his career declined. In later years, Brando appeared on screen in heavy, disjointed scenes, portraying hollow characters that mirrored his own spiritual emptiness. He was lazy, arrogant, and openly contemptuous of professional standards. Brando read his lines from cue cards, from scraps of paper taped to walls, from coffee cups, even from his co-stars' foreheads. In his memoir songs My Mother Taught Me, Brando himself confessed to thinking like a con artist, exposing himself as a liar and emotional manipulator, living adrift amid desire and the burden of fame. Brando had made history with On the Waterfront and shattered cinematic boundaries with A Streetcar Named Desire. But what followed? A string of disappointing films, an attitude of arrogance, and the image of an aging, lethargic legend, weighing up to 140 kilograms. And if Marlon Brando represented the tragedy of a genius who destroyed himself, then the next name on Newman's list embodied something even darker: chaos and danger, a Hollywood monster no one dared to confront head-on. 4. Frank Sinatra, a madman with an unstable psyche and shocking outbursts of violence. When Time Ran Out, 1980, a disaster in every sense of the word. Both on screen and behind the scenes, was the only time Paul Newman and Frank Sinatra ever shared the same film set. Yet according to those who witnessed it, just a few days of working together were enough for Sinatra to leave an indelible impression on Newman. Newman could not tolerate the way Frank carried himself like a king, never reading the script, never rehearsing his lines, showing up only to shoot a single scene and then leaving immediately, as if the entire world owed him a debt. To Newman, this was not merely a matter of attitude, it was a blatant insult to the acting profession itself. The tension between them did not remain quietly simmering, it erupted openly. According to William Holden, their co-star in the film, there was a fierce confrontation after Sinatra arrived nearly 3 hours late, forcing the entire crew to wait in utter futility. Holden recalled, "Paul isn't the kind of guy who loses his temper easily. But that day, he walked straight up to Frank and said, 'You're wasting everyone's time here, and you're showing no respect at all.' And Frank, he just smirked and walked away." Stories surrounding Sinatra went far beyond simple unprofessionalism. He was often described as a lovable landmine capable of sudden warmth, followed almost instantly by explosive rage. As The New Yorker once wrote, Sinatra was extremely sensitive, easily wounded, and could fly into a fury over the slightest criticism. His reactions were often irritable, uncontrolled, and at times openly violent. On one occasion, he reportedly pressured a restaurant manager into physically assaulting writer Dominic Dunne, simply because Sinatra disliked an article Dunne had written for Vanity Fair. Sinatra's personal life was equally chaotic, a relentless cycle of emotional turmoil. After being betrayed by Ava Gardner, he once attempted suicide by lying inside a gas oven. His mental state was widely considered deeply unstable. At times he would break down in tears like a child after arguments with Mia Farrow, to the point that friends mockingly nicknamed him Crybaby, a label completely at odds with the tough public image he projected. On one particularly disturbing occasion, Sinatra even urinated on the grave of a deceased journalist, an act that left many people horrified. Years later, Paul Newman still could not conceal his disappointment with the artist. In an interview, when asked about people who had fallen asleep on their own fame, he replied briefly, yet clearly enough for everyone to know whom he meant. "Some people believe talent can excuse behavior. I've never believed that, and I never will." When asked directly about Sinatra in a 1994 interview, Newman did not dodge the question, but his answer consisted of only a single sentence. Frank had a very good singing voice. Not a single word about acting, not a single positive remark about work ethic. But perhaps the greatest shock was still ahead, because the person Newman found hardest to forgive was someone once very close to him, a friend. A legendary co-star, an icon of the screen whom he had once believed to be unbreakable. 5. Robert Redford, the king of tardiness and an inexcusable lack of responsibility. Robert Redford may have been Paul Newman's most perfectly matched co-star on screen. But in real life, he became the greatest test of Newman's patience. Together, they created two immortal cinematic landmarks, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting. Yet behind the scenes, according to numerous accounts, there was a little-known truth: Newman couldn't stand Redford. The reason was painfully clear: Robert Redford's chronic lateness, lack of responsibility, and persistent indifference. Director George Roy Hill, the man behind both films, once stated bluntly, "Paul was the kind of guy who showed up at 6 in the morning. Lines memorized, every movement carefully prepared, and then what happened? The entire crew stood around, waiting, and kept waiting for Redford to arrive like a star who was fashionably late." Sidney Pollack, a longtime collaborator of Redford, did not shy away from the truth either. Robert has a very strange relationship with time. It's not that he's trying to insult anyone. He just lives in a completely different time zone. One famous anecdote from the filming of The Sting says it all. The entire crew once gave Newman a special watch, on which every number had been replaced with the word Redford. The meaning was obvious. At any moment, it was always Redford time, meaning dead time spent waiting for someone who was never on time. But what irritated Newman the most was not just the lateness. It was the fact that Redford would still deliver a maddeningly brilliant performance, even when he arrived late like some kind of savior. Newman once complained to George Roy Hill, "That kid can show up 3 hours late and still pull off a scene better than 10 actors who've rehearsed all week." The public may have hailed him as a legendary duo, but the frustration in their relationship was very real. Even though the two could later laugh it off, that irritation never truly disappeared. At an American Film Institute, AFI, tribute, Newman once joked, only half in jest, "Working with Robert Redford taught me the biggest lesson of my life, patience. I didn't have it before I met him, and I needed all the patience I had when working with him." And if even a close friend like Redford could make Newman grit his teeth in endurance, what would happen when he faced someone whose every word and every action challenged everything Newman believed in? 6. Tom Cruise, a cult devotee, and the habit of turning every stage into a one-man show. Tom Cruise once shared the screen with Paul Newman in The Color of Money, 1986. But behind the camera unfolded a quiet confrontation. Paul Newman could not stand Tom Cruise. At the time, Cruise was at the peak of his fame, overflowing with energy and ambition. But in Newman's eyes, a man who valued humility, discipline, and restraint, Cruise embodied everything he despised: an inflated ego, unrestrained self-promotion, and a kind of performative enthusiasm that Newman mockingly described as acting even when there was no camera rolling. Paul saw Tom as a PR tornado with no off switch. A crew member recalled wearily, "The kid genuinely idolized Paul, but the way he showed it made Paul want to bang his head against the wall." Tom talked non-stop, as if Paul existed solely to amplify Tom's own greatness. On set, Newman was constantly irritated by Cruise's relentless bouncing around, as if he downed a massive can of Red Bull every morning. At press conferences, that irritation became even more apparent. Cruise repeatedly interrupted Newman, rambling on about what he learned from Paul, his training regimen, and his acting method, all of which Newman regarded as absurdly overblown bragging. Director Martin Scorsese once recounted that after one interview, Newman walked straight up to Cruise's manager and said coldly, "If that kid says one more time that he learned something from me, then cuts me off to promote himself again, I'll throw him out the window." But Newman's disdain for Cruise did not stop at his showy ego. What Newman truly found unacceptable was Cruise's role as a high-ranking member and fervent evangelist of Scientology, an organization many regard as a cult. Scientology has been accused of brainwashing its followers, cutting them off from their families, and employing disturbing methods of thought reform. Cruise was widely criticized for being complicit in, or at the very least turning a blind eye to, the organization's practices of control, surveillance, and psychological abuse. One of the most shocking allegations illustrated the extreme level of control the cult exerted over Cruise's life. Scientology reportedly took part in selecting his romantic partners. Actress Nazanin Boniadi revealed that she had been instructed to be trained to become Cruise's girlfriend. His ex-wife Nicole Kidman was allegedly disconnected from her children by the organization following the divorce. All of this stood in complete opposition to the values of personal freedom and integrity that Newman had always upheld. When publicly asked about Cruise, Newman offered only a measured remark: "He's a dedicated young man, full of energy. It's just that sometimes that energy is a bit more than necessary." He never attacked anyone outright in public, but to those who understood him, that sentence carried deep contempt. Cruise, on the other hand, was obsessed with control, refusing to let co-stars sit in chairs higher than his, demanding camera angles that concealed his real height, around 1.70 meters, behaviors that exposed deep insecurity and an almost pathological need to control his image. And if Tom Cruise symbolized manipulation in the modern era, then the final name on Newman's list represented a toxic remnant of history, something Newman could not and would never accept. 7. Charlton Heston, the conservative and the talent abused by power. Paul Newman never shared the screen with Charlton Heston, but that did nothing to ease the tension between them. On the contrary, the name Charlton Heston, the Moses of Hollywood, became one of the most irreconcilable conflicts on Newman's list. The clash between Newman and Heston was not personal, but ideological, a profound confrontation rooted in philosophy and morality. Newman was a progressive who actively fought for civil rights, opposed the Vietnam War, and openly supported Democratic candidates such as Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy. On the opposite side, Heston gradually became a symbol of conservatism, although he had supported the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He later pivoted sharply to the right, serving as president of the National Rifle Association, NRA, and becoming the public face of armed individualism. The conflict reached its peak in 1966, during a highly charged election season. That year, Newman and Heston happened to be at the same restaurant in Los Angeles. Newman was campaigning for the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy, while Heston openly supported the Vietnam War. Witnesses recalled that Newman, known for his near-absolute courtesy, quietly turned away, coldly ignored Heston, and refused to acknowledge his presence, even though they were seated just a few tables apart. Newman's wife later spoke candidly about this in a 2010 interview. Paul could not reconcile the image of the great Moses on screen with the man standing in front of the NRA, holding up a rifle and declaring, "From my cold, dead hands." To him, that was a tragic abuse of celebrity power. Actor Robert Vaughn also confirmed this sentiment. Paul never forgave anyone who used their fame to spread messages he believed were dangerous. And Charlton Heston was the clearest example of that. One of Newman's remarks in a 1978 interview, widely believed to be a veiled but razor-sharp criticism aimed directly at Heston, became legendary within the film industry. For Newman, political differences were not merely disagreements of opinion. They were matters of morality, responsibility, and integrity.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
He believed that freedom cannot be built on the barrel of a gun, but must rest on humanity, reason, and compassion. According to Melissa Newman, the daughter of the legendary Paul Newman, the secret list her father left behind was never meant as a place to vent anger or trade in sensational gossip. On the contrary, it was a harsh and unsparing act of self-examination, about the profession itself, about professional ethics, and about the price of complacency in an industry built on illusion. In a 2018 interview, Melissa shared, "My father believed that once you succeed in cinema, you carry responsibility with you. Responsibility to the audiences who pay for tickets, to the crew members who work 14-hour days so you can shine, and to the very craft of acting that you represent." For that reason, Newman's list was never aimed at failures. Quite the opposite, it gathered the biggest names in Hollywood, people who, in Newman's view, had failed to use their talent and fame responsibly. In the early 2000s, while battling the cancer that would ultimately take his life in 2008, Newman began what his close friend A.E. Hochner called a life inventory.
Voice generated by VB.VN.
Hochner recalled, "Paul no longer wanted to leave things unsaid. He didn't want to embellish anything. That list was part of his effort to look straight at his career, both the light and the darkness." Even Joanne Woodward, Newman's partner of more than 50 years, confirmed this perspective. Paul was always gracious in public, but when he was facing death, he was more honest with himself than ever before. This list was part of that honesty. At first, the list was kept completely secret. but during the research for a comprehensive biography of Paul Newman published in 2022. A series of interviews with his closest collaborators inadvertently revealed its existence. As the fragments were pieced together, the portrait of an uncompromising Paul Newman gradually emerged. Director Stuart Rosenberg, who worked closely with Newman on Cool Hand Luke and many other projects, stated plainly, Paul had very clear principles, but he never allowed his personal views to interfere with professionalism. On set, he always gave everything he had, even when working with people who irritated him the most. Actress Jessica Tandy once described that same spirit. Paul had things he liked and things he didn't, but you would never know that standing next to him on a set. He gave everyone the same respect and the same level of focus. At a superficial glance, Newman's list might look like a slap in the face to famous colleagues. But on closer inspection, it reads as a call to wake up. Hollywood may forgive many things, but not negligence toward the artistic mission itself. Ironically, Robert Redford, Newman's lifelong, perfectly matched co-star, was the person who irritated him the most. The reason was not only Redford's chronic lateness or his freewheeling work habits, but the simple fact that Redford could arrive 3 hours late and still deliver a transcendent performance. As if divinely blessed, Newman once complained to George Roy Hill,
Voice generated by VB.VN.
"That kid makes me want to smash my watch every morning." When Redford learned that his name was on the list, he didn't get angry, he simply laughed and said, "I'm honored. Paul never tolerated fools. If I drove him crazy and he still worked with me, that's the greatest compliment I've ever received." Paul Newman's secret list was never meant to be a collection of backstage anecdotes for cheap entertainment. It is a profound portrait of an artist with principles, a man who refused to compromise with carelessness, and a star who understood that success does not excuse irresponsibility. Leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep following the stories behind legendary figures. Because sometimes, what defines them isn't the moment they stand under the spotlight, but the scars they quietly carry with them for a lifetime.